Changes, a Generation X-based fic. Chapter 3. Fear of the Unknown. Richard Cale could not believe what was happening. The flashes of pain and trauma were so intense, his own personality almost caved into it. New images were flashing through his mind, and they evolved a war-torn country and a frightening man in a mask. For a moment that man loomed over him, and out of instinct he moved his arms to push the man away. However, it wasn't working. Soon a new voice was in his head. This one was female, and it sounded familiar for some reason. It even spoke in a different language and dialect. It was so odd, yet so familiar. His grandfather had drilled into him many different languages for all their trips. This one was Serbo-Croatian. That language always stuck out in his mind, but he didn't fully remember why. All he could recall of that trip was a little red-haired girl who had been 7 years younger. It was then he finally translated the words. "Who are you?" At that point, the voice was drowned out by shouting. He also felt his own personality reassert itself. He quickly realized that the girl had stepped away, out of his power's active radius. He opened his eyes and noticed that everyone was talking and looking at him and someone he couldn't see. They all looked worried, and some seemed a bit panicked. He tried to say something to assure them, but speaking was a great strain. He then looked at his hands and was shocked by what he saw. His hands were red and claw-like. He was also sure that these claws would cut through anything. The young girl, known only as Penance, watched as everyone rushed to the man. He was new and unknown, and she was watching him and wanted to find out about who he was. He had been talking to everyone, and she got closer, trying to understand what he said, but also watching for a threat. Given how her life had gone, she knew to be careful around anyone. However, the panic happened when she got too close while in the shadows. She had watched him fall and go into seizures. She had been told once about something like this, back when she was younger. Someone her parents knew had been prone to this, and told her to get them if she ever saw it happen. It didn't at the time, but she remembered it now. However, this wasn't the same. As the man's body convulsed, it transformed into a male version of her own body. She remained transfixed on the form, and wondered who this man was. As the others gathered around him, she kept thinking in her mind, "Who are you?" She wanted to know. She wanted to know why he seemed a bit familiar now as well. She wanted an answer to at least one of those questions, but was brought back to the moment when she noticed others were looking in her direction. They seemed to think she was at the source of what was happening, but she couldn't understand why. It was the one who was related to him that first saw her and pointed to her. She did not trust this girl. The girl then shouted to the man in charge of this place, the noisemaker, and said something. However, it wasn't until the girl in the yellow jacket, the one who she remembered had a name, Jubilee, and who treated her as a sister, motioned her to step back, that she did so. When she did, she noticed the man had stopped thrashing about. At that moment, everyone seemed to go silent, and the man started to move again. It appeared he was examining his body, and everyone was asking about how he was. Was this power a surprise to them all? She then watched as he sat up and looked in her direction. She was stunned at how his hair seemed similar to hers, if not a bit darker, and his eyes were a solid brown, in contrast to her own solid blue eyes. She was then stunned when he had a look of pure concentration on his face, and then spoke. "It's all right. I guess you didn't know what would happen. Do you understand me now?" She nodded, shocked that he knew her native tongue. No one here had known it. How did he know it? And why did he seem familiar, as if she had seen him long ago? She saw a kind smile cross his face, and she was sure she was starting to blush. He was handsome, and the smile was so comforting. He seemed to truly understand her. "We'll talk later, if that's okay." She nodded and watched as his body started to take on their former features. It didn't change how he looked to her. Even like this, he was handsome. He was also someone who she could communicate with and talk to. She felt at ease for the first time since him, and she wasn't afraid. Once everyone had backed away, Angelo could see a look of shock on their faces, and he felt better knowing that everyone shared the shock he was feeling. Growing up in the hood of L.A., he had seen and done some shocking things. It was part of the reason he faked his death and came to Xavier's school. However, all of the things he had seen could not have prepared him for this shocking sight. Richard Cale, who was the newest student at the school, while holding Penance's powers, spoke in an odd language, and Penance understood him. It was as if a miracle had happened. Once the shock of the moment passed, and Richard started to look like his normal self, Sean voiced the question that was on everyone's mind. "Lad, what the hell did you say, and in what language? We've been trying to talk to her since she got here." He watched as Richard instinctively pushed his glasses back, looked at everyone, then back at Penance, who seemed to be watching the new student, before he spoke. "I spoke in her native tongue. I'm guessing you didn't know she was from Yugoslavia?" He noticed that Penance seemed to nod at this, like she had understood that word. He then saw the shocked look fall from Monet's face, as her question seemed to break everyone out of it. "How in the world did you figure that out?" It was odd that the self-proclaimed perfect person would ask such a dumb question. At that moment he watched as Richard looked straight at her, with a look that seemed shocked that the question was asked. Almost in a flat tone, he said, "You're the smart one, right?" Monet just nodded, and Richard continued, "I figured. You lack common sense. My one relative's the same way." He watched as a look of anger crossed Monet's normally perfect face. "How dare you say such a thing?" "I will." Before she could go off, Richard held up his hand and continued. "You do remember what I said about my powers, don't you?" In that moment, Monet made a slight squeaking noise and shrank back a bit. He almost chuckled when Jubilee placed a hand on Monet's shoulder and said, "Don't get upset, Monet. He pulled the same thing on me earlier. I think he's going to fit in here very well." Angelo had to agree with that. He then noticed that Richard was looking at Penance again, and he could tell their eyes were locked on one another. He also noticed that Penance gave Richard a smile, and it looked like the smile of someone who had feelings for someone. He realized Richard noticed it as well, as the new student just said, "It looks like I've made my first friend here." Something in the tone told Angelo that Richard seemed to think the same way as Penance did. Sean brought them all back to the amazing event that had happened. He watched as Sean cautiously stepped forward, yet kept a safe distance from the new student. "Lad, I know it may be linked to your power, but how did you know she was from Yugoslavia? And how did you know about the language?" For a brief moment he saw Richard look away from Penance and turn to Sean. In that moment he was certain he saw a slight panic in the new student's eyes. It was almost as if he would be trying to explain something that he could not answer at all. However, that look disappeared as the new student answered, "Well, during that moment, I saw some images of a war-torn country. Then I heard her speaking in my head, and something told me it was Serbo-Croatian. Now, I think I did a report on Yugoslavia at school, and I remembered those facts from that." Angelo noticed that Everett's eyes were showing a bit of surprise. "You must have a very good memory." He nodded in agreement, even though it seemed like an odd thing to remember. He watched as the new student shrugged. "What can I say? I remember trivia. Never know when it will come in handy." He nodded again, but something in him wondered, what would make someone look for something so obscure to everyday knowledge? His thoughts were interrupted when Sean cleared his throat. "Well, now that that's over, I think it would be best for ye to have a quiet tour of the grounds. Angelo, would ye do the honours?" Angelo nodded, and then motioned to the exit of the hall. "See, if you will follow me, Richard, I shall show you around the grounds and eventually to our computer center." He decided to ham it up with a few extravagant gestures. He led the way out as Richard fell right into step behind him. "Lead the way, senor." As they headed out, he received his first question. "By the way, what's your full name, Angelo?" When they reached the outside, Angelo answered the question. "Angelo Espinosa. Of course, they all tend to call me Ange around here. And before you ask, I came from L.A." He started to point out the various buildings, making sure Richard knew what each one was. Just as he had told him about Proudstar Hall, Richard asked him another question. "So, what is it like around here?" Angelo didn't need to ask what he meant by that question. He stopped for a moment, placing his arms to his side as he thought. "For the most part, it's on the quiet side. The only times it isn't quiet is when someone tries to cause us some problems. That usually happens once a week. He heard a slight relieved noise come from the new student as he spoke. That's quieter than my hometown. It was turning into a real city in leaps. I just had to get away from it all. Again, Angelo noticed that there was something more. But he didn't want to ask since it was the guy's first day at the school. Angelo started to pull out a cigarette, a bad habit he had gotten into some time ago. Well, I hate to say it, but you may be leaving one bad place for another. If if that's how you're judging things. As he lit the cigarette, he was stunned by Richard's response. What makes you say that, other than your imitation of a steam engine? He didn't even get it to his lips, so stunned by the comment. He glanced over at Richard, who just had a slight smile on his face. It was a smile that showed no malice, and maybe even tolerance of the habit. He gave Richard a slight smile in response. Taking lessons on smart remarks? He had to grin when Richard just shrugged. Maybe. I do like some of the classics, but I like to come up with new material. Besides, you never know when a good quip is going to stun your opponent. Angelo chuckled and then continued. Well, you may have to get used to that. Since we are a mutant school, trouble seems to come our way a lot. Monet will be telling you about some of the troubles we faced here when we get to the computer room. He watched as Richard's smile grew, and then saw the reason why the new student never seemed to smile too broadly. His teeth had obviously come in crooked, but he stopped looking when Richard spoke in a slightly different accent. I like the sound of that. Angelo didn't want to ask on the teeth, and decided it was time to continue the tour. He made sure he pointed out every other building, making sure to note the biosphere. He was certain Richard would get to see that building enough as he developed his unique powers. Soon it was time to head in. He knew Monet would be waiting in the computer room. As they headed there, Angelo took a moment to reflect on what he had learned about the new student. However, he also had a feeling that Richard might surprise Monet or irritate her. Once he left Richard there, he wondered who he should feel sorry for. Monet quietly watched as Angelo left, most likely to have a smoke outside. Angelo was a nice enough person, but he had done the upsetting thing of looking at her diary. He had almost found out something before her brother had revealed their relationship. This time, she was sure she would be in control of when the new student learned that ugly truth about her. When she was finally sure Angelo was out of earshot, she motioned to the computer they used for all their Generation X information and looked at Richard. Hello again, Richard. My name is Monet St. Croix. I'd like to personally welcome you to the school. She was stunned when Richard bowed, almost as if he could tell something about her family. It is an honor to be here. Would I be incorrect in assuming you come from a well-known family? And if my actions offend, I apologize. For a moment she was flattered by his actions, and was momentarily speechless. However, she quickly returned to what she had been about to say. It is all right. Anyhow, I have the duty of familiarizing you with the computer, as well as some of the files we have on it. She then noticed that he raised an eyebrow at that, like he was suspecting something. Let me guess. Mr. Cassidy, or should I say Sean, was a bit worried about my actions at the airport, and has entrusted you to find out. She gave a slight smile. Yes and no. Yes, I was already supposed to familiarize you with some of the foes we have had to deal with, but he did not mention anything about what had happened. She saw a surprised look on his face, mixed with a bit of skepticism. Are you sure? The truth can surface in ugly ways. She knew how true his last statement was, but refrained from saying anything about her brother, at least until Richard saw the file they had. She then activated the main computer in the computer center. This is our version of the Cerebro computer at the main school. It has a file on every mutant that the X-Men has ever encountered, as well as every foe that Generation X has ever faced. She heard Richard let out a low whistle. I take it you're going to show me people and mutants I should avoid, especially if they are mutants. She nodded and brought up the image from the first file she had pre-selected. Soon, an image of a figure that resembled the Grim Reaper appeared on the screen. This is Executioner. From what we have been told, he kills any mutant whom he feels has killed the human. She looked at Richard, who instead of reacting negatively, just studied the figure. Sounds like it fits the name. He does appear to have a death fixation with that costume. He came after someone here? She nodded. Yes, they were not here at the time, but he pursued Angelo. He had believed that Angelo had stolen the identity of a dead teen. In actuality, it seems that the executioner was mistaken. Apparently, only Angelo and Jonathan know the reason for that mistake. But they have not told us. It's not something they talk about. She watched as Richard nodded again. She wondered if Richard would ask if the man was a mutant or not, but no question came. She then switched to the next file. Soon the image switched to a figure garbed in red, with what appeared to be mechanical tendrils coming from his arms. This is Omega Red. We have only had one encounter with him. She watched Richard for a moment, and she noticed he took a slight step back from the screen. Definitely not a happy camper. Is it just me, or did he seem to get in the extra ugly line when looks were handed out? She stifled a laugh, wondering if the new student's way of coping with things was to crack a joke. No, science made him that way. What is more disturbing is that his mutant power is to generate a death spore. She noticed Richard cringe at that, as if he were imagining his powers doing that. During his attack here, Jonathan was the one to beat him. It's a bit unclear if the spore would have affected Jonathan, since it appears he can't die. After a moment, she decided it was time to show Richard their chief adversary. She took the image of Omega Red off the screen, but paused before she brought up the file on her brother. The file I'm about to show you is of the one who will most likely be seen attacking. They are a serious threat to the school and to mutants. She then brought up the image of M-Plate. In that moment, she realized something was wrong. It was the scream that tipped her off. She quickly spun to look at Richard, who had retreated to a corner. She wondered if there was a lingering bit of penance's fear in him, forcing him to get as far away from the image as possible. She even noticed he was holding his face in his hands. She started to step towards him, but stopped. Getting too close to him now might make things worse. She asked a question that she hoped would get her an answer she expected to hear. "Did you see that image in Penance's memories? The image of—" She was cut off short when he slightly nodded and then shook his head. He then managed to point at the image, and his words were enough to tell her everything. The hands. That is what Penance feared. He saw me. I just hope he didn't follow me here. She swallowed, and was thankful there was an intercom to Sean's office nearby. She pushed the call button, certain that he would be in there, and said, "Sir, you better get down here. It's about what happened." She then bit her lip, hoping Sean would get down there in a hurry. Sean had rushed to the computer room the second Monet had contacted him on the intercom. Part of him was glad that they were close to figuring out what had happened at the airport, but the urgency in Monet's voice told him that he would not be happy about what they had found out. Those thoughts were confirmed when he entered the room and saw Richard shrinking into a corner, Monet at the computer, and the image of M-Plate displayed. It was the one thing that worried him most. He then said in a calming tone, "Rich, are you all right? What spooked you, lad?" The answer he received was not what he expected, but it confirmed his worst fears about the airport. The hands. He glanced back at the image, and then motioned for Monet to turn the image off. As she did so, he looked back at Richard, inwardly amazed that the lad had picked up on M-Plate's presence. He didn't see M-Plate there, but that could have been because he was out of sync with their dimension. It was possible that the way Richard's powers worked, that trick would not work on him. Care to explain what happened at the airport, then? He was thankful that the lad briefly nodded and said in a shaky voice, "When I left the plane and started in your direction, I shifted the weight on my bags. When I did that, I noticed mouths forming on my hands." He watched as the lad shuddered a bit. "I had somehow gotten close to him, but I couldn't see him at all. He could have just grabbed me there." He then shuddered again, but appeared to calm down. "At least he didn't approach me." Sean was thankful for that as well. He then moved over to Monet, noticing that the fear of the moment was starting to wear off. He softly said to her, "I think you better talk with him about this, lass. You know more about the blighter than any of us, except for Penance. And don't leave anything out the way you did with all of us after you arrived." He watched as she silently nodded, and then headed out of the room. As he did so, he decided that this new revelation had to be told to Emma. It would give them a new insight to Richard's power, and maybe a way to detect M-Plate when he was nearby, but out of sync. Richard heard Sean leave, and chanced to look at where the horrifying image had been. The image was no longer there, but just from what he could tell, it was a foe of the school's. Also, judging by the reaction, M-Plate was a big threat. He started to stand, and almost jumped back when Monet spoke. "I guess I should inform you about M-Plate." He had forgotten she was in the room. He started to get out of the corner of the room, inwardly ashamed that he acted that way. He could recall something like that terror once, a vague recollection involving hiding from something, but he shook that notion away. He then looked over at Monet and said, "Are you the resident expert on that thing?" "That thing, M-plate, I am sad to say is my brother." That revelation almost smacked him in the face. He was even ready to bolt out the door, slightly afraid of her. It couldn't be possible that something that horrid could be her brother. Before he could say anything, she said, "And to put your fears to rest, I am nothing like my brother. In fact, he hates me to the core. I believe the primary reason is that since we are siblings, he cannot sup on me." Richard blinked for a moment as the word hit him. While it was a small word, it carried the meaning of one of mankind's greatest taboos. He looked at Monet and said, "You don't mean he—" He didn't want to complete the sentence. He gasped when she nodded and responded to the incomplete question. "Yes, he feeds off the marrow. When he does that, he gains their powers. He is even able to use powers that are used on him, but not to the effect that he can when he's supping on a mutant." He then felt a chill go through his body when she said that. "I have no doubt he would feed on you as well, unless he could turn you into a being like himself." In that moment he felt like he was going to be sick. It was one of his deepest fears possibly coming true. This thing could turn him into one like him, except in a way none might have imagined. He leaned against the wall and looked at Monet again. The look on her face told him that revealing that information was a toll on her. "I take it that put a strain on your friendships here?" She nodded and explained. "Yes, some time ago he attacked the school, capturing everyone separately. When I had returned, he was here, had everyone bound, and said, 'Hello, little sister.' Only now are the bridges being mended." He could understand the damage that paranoia caused. He then saw where the most tense possible relationship was. The girl he had met called Penance. It was obvious to him that she had been a victim of that monster. He looked at the door and said, "How much do you think Penance knows about him?" He glanced back when he didn't get an immediate response, and saw that Monet appeared lost in thought. For a minute he could have sworn he saw a look of deep concentration on her face. He was about to ask again when she said, "I would believe she could give you a first-hand account of what he does to his prisoners. We don't even know how long he had her." He tapped his foot for a moment and said softly, "I hope she doesn't mind me asking about him." He then looked towards Monet and noticed a slight look of amazement on her face. As an afterthought, he added, "I mean, after what I saw, I think I should get advice of someone who had survived being his victim." Monet then nodded and said, "Well, if that's the case, you could talk with Everett. He had been the victim of my brother as well. My brother had even possessed him." He let out a low whistle. Whoa. I wonder who took that worse, him or Jubilee? He quickly clapped a hand over his mouth, realizing what he had just said. He had not intended to blurt that out. He noticed Monet eyeing him at that statement, and he could see no other way to explain it. When Jubilee had shown me to my dorm, I got too close to her and my powers kicked in. I could tell she likes him. In that moment, Monet's eyebrows rose in surprise. That's no secret around here. However, it is amazing you picked up on that fact. Even after a day here, you would have known that. The way she said it, he felt ashamed. It was one aspect of his power he hated. It made him feel like a voyeur. He now felt like he had to get away from her. He hated feeling this awkward. I guess I should see the next thing on the tour now. He looked around, hoping that whomever was supposed to show him the next thing was nearby. That will be the med center. Not. He turned to face the person who spoke, noticing a man around his age standing at the door. He also noticed that the young man was covered in black straps, as if he was trying to hide something. At this time, Richard was at a point where his power wasn't locked in on anyone. He looked at the man and said, Okay, and who are you, since I don't think we were introduced yet? Again the man spoke, and Richard could swear it was more in his head than vocally. My name's Jonathan Evans Starsmorn. Richard closed his eyes for a moment, trying to recall why the name sounded familiar. In a second it hit him. You're the one who defeated that Omega Red character. From what Monet had told me, it had to have been tough. If you don't mind, I'd like to shake your hand. He started to move forward and extend his hand. In that moment he saw Jonathan raise his arms as if to stop him. I don't think that would be. He never heard the rest of the comment because an explosion happened at that moment, and it knocked him back. He thought he heard Monet yelling, but he was unsure of it since his ears were ringing. He also tried to see what had caused the explosion, but the near blinding red flare in front of him made it hard to see. It was then he noticed that the flare was coming from him. He glanced down, and just where his mouth and chest would have been was the red flare. At that moment his hearing came back as he heard Sean enter the room. What the hell happened? He could tell that Sean had figured out what had happened, since the Irishman was looking right at him. I see. First time meeting Jono. Richard nodded and looked down at himself again. Now he understood why Jono's voice was so weird. It was psychically done. Yes, after Monet had explained the Omega Red thing, I thought it only proper to congratulate him. I just didn't realize how his powers manifested or their result. Quite odd. Just as he said that, he felt the power start to leave him, and watched as his body reformed. As it did so, he heard Jonah say, I did try to warn him. You are never told how my powers manifested. Let's just say you were lucky, and that no one was seriously injured. In those words, Richard could tell loads about when Jonathan's powers appeared. He waited until his mouth reformed to speak. I think from now on, I should be made aware of everyone's abilities. I think that should avoid any other awkward moments. He then stood up, brushing himself off. I don't think we need more of them. He saw Sean nod in agreement. That makes sense. Of those you have met one-on-one, Jonathan here is a psi mutant who generates psi blasts from the chamber area here. He saw Sean motion to the strapped-up area of Jonathan's outfit. As you know, I have a sonic screen. Jubilation, who has shown you to your room, can generate plasmids. Angelo has an extra 6 feet of skin and the power to control it. And Monet has a whole range of powers which she seems to expertly use. He glanced over at Monet for a moment. He could not believe she was a student if she could handle the range of powers she had. You can use all your powers with expertise. No one is that perfect. He noticed a scowl cross her face. I beg to differ. I'm sure everyone here could benefit from my talent for keeping control. For the first time, he noticed a smug tone in her voice, which he hadn't before. He glared at her for a moment and then remembered what he had just learned. If that's the case, Monet, then why haven't you sorted out the discovery of your older brother? He saw her eyes narrow as he said it, but he continued, You kept that a secret, and I don't doubt there are others. He noticed she was about to retort, but quickly closed her mouth before muttering, Mon Dieu, I never thought of that. In that moment he noticed she had stopped and seemed to be standing stock still and started staring out into nowhere. After a moment he heard Jonathan say, It might be best if we go to the medical center now. If you're waiting for her to respond, she is in one of her states. It may be a bit before she responds. Besides, it could be helpful in case of another incident. He nodded in agreement and let Jonathan show him the way there.